Let's bring in Jim Walsh, Senior Research Associate at MIT's Security Studies program. He's in Boston, Massachusetts. Jim, thanks for joining us.
Happy to be with you, Elaine.
So the era of strategic patience is over. That's what Vice President Pence said in his visit to the demilitarized zone. What does that statement mean to you, coming from the Vice President and spoken just feet from North Korea?
Well, I think what it's supposed to mean, I think it has two meanings. One, the Obama policy was something called strategic patience. And as we well know, Mr. Trump does not have a lot of fondness for anything that Mr. Obama did. But I think they're using the word patience almost rhetorically. And what they're trying to communicate is we're not going to sit around and wait for this problem to get worse. We're going to do something. But when you actually look at the policies, they're actually very, very similar. They both emphasize sanctions. They both emphasize reassuring South Korea and Japan. The only difference, and it's an important difference, will be if the Trump administration decides to pursue diplomacy, because Mr. Obama did not do that. And my guess is the Chinese are going to demand that Mr. Trump does that if China's going to step up to the plate and do what he wants them to do. So it might be different, but right now they're more or less the same, but with the hope that there might be a little more diplomacy.
Well, Vice President Pence warned North Korea not to test the United States and its allies. But on the other hand, he also raised the possibility the U.S. could pursue talks. What do you think is North Korea's understanding of the U.S. position at this point?
Well, in the months during the election, before the U.S. presidential election, North Korean officials would tell Americans in Track 2 meetings that they were open to meeting with Mr. Trump. And so my guess is they haven't rejected that as a possibility. Moreover, China has really put some pressure on North Korea, threatening indirectly to cut off oil shipments, which would really damage the North Korean economy. So I think under the right circumstances, there's actually, for the first chance for the first time in many, many years, that the parties could sit down together. And I think that's critical. You know, I think some diplomacy trying to get a freeze on the program would be a win. But even if you didn't get that, things are so dicey right now. The U.S. is engaged in bluster. The North Koreans are engaged in bluster. And so the chance for miscalculation or misperception, I think, is very high. And so if we want to avoid a war that is avoidable, then it's important that all the parties have direct communications, regardless of whether they can come to an agreement. They need to talk to each other. Hold your friends close, hold your enemies closer, so that we don't have an accidental war, which is really the danger on the peninsula.
Well, it's interesting. The vice president cited the recent U.S. action in Syria and Afghanistan as proof of U.S. strength and resolve. What did you make of his citing recent demonstrations of military force?
You know, I don't think that's going anywhere here, to be quite honest. I mean, Syria, Afghanistan, compared to North Korea, that's not apples and oranges. That's apples and washing machines. I mean, Syria doesn't have nuclear weapons. Afghanistan doesn't have nuclear weapons. Those two countries don't have thousands of artillery tubes pointed at the capital city of a U.S. ally like North Korea does. And moreover, while the Russians are involved in Syria, it's not like they're on the border. They don't share a border with Syria. China is right there on the border. So I think these are wildly different situations. I don't think the vice president's going to get much by trying to invoke bombing an empty air base in Syria or dropping a bomb on tunnels in Afghanistan. I don't think that's going to work.
So, Jim, if that's the case, is there a risk for the administration if it opens up the suggestion that these other attacks were partially intended as a message to North Korea?
Absolutely. I think there's a real risk in this. And again, one is misperception, right? That the North Koreans just aren't going to understand what's going on here and make a mistake of their own. But there's also a risk for the Trump administration. You know, there's this old notion that you don't wave a gun around unless you're prepared to use it. So what happens if we make all these threats and then North Korea responds with tests? And then we're forced, do we attack them? Do we not attack them? We probably won't. That's what the Trump policy review suggests, that military options are not at the front of the line. And then what happens? You look weak, and then people don't pay attention when you try to invoke a threat the next time. So I think we ought to be careful in the language we use. There's a reason why governments, leaders, diplomats are careful about what they say because they don't want it to be taken the wrong way, and they don't want to set up a circumstance that a chapter, 2 chapters down the road, your threats come back to haunt you.
Well, Chris Hill, former ambassador to South Korea, said this weekend that President Trump is trying to out-North Korean the North Koreans with his aggressive rhetoric. As a matter of strategy, how would you characterize the president's messaging so far?
I think that's definitely the case. I mean, if we include the tweeting in the messaging, it's definitely about, you know, if China doesn't solve this, we're going to solve it on our own. USA, they're in a lot of trouble. They're a bad actor. I don't think much of that is very helpful. And I think the underlying premise is incorrect. This is not about a problem that the U.S. is going to solve by itself. Number one, we cannot solve it without China. That's just the geopolitical reality. And number two, we shouldn't be talking about solving it on our own because we have this ally, South Korea. If a war breaks out, guess where they're fighting? They're fighting in South Korea. And South Korea does not have an elected president. They don't have an election until early May. Their most recent president was impeached. So I don't think we should be sort of marching off half-cocked here, shooting from the hip, when our ally doesn't even have a president that we can consult with. Let's not substitute strategic haste for strategic patience. Let's be methodical. Let's be careful. Let's work with our allies. Let's get on the same page. That's how you can be effective.
All right, Jim Walsh, thanks very much for your insight. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Elaine.